I'm Dr. Harriet Harris, and I'm the Dean of Pratt School of Architecture. And I'd like to read to you today The Sexual Politics of Meat, or an excerpt from this book by Carol J. Adams. Obviously, the context for doing this is the rather fabulous Architecture Foundation's bedtime stories. Clearly, it is not really bedtime right now in New York. It's more cocktail hour or afternoon nap time. So do indulge me if you're watching this from the UK. As you probably know, I'm the Dean of Pratt School of Architecture, and I moved here in time for the pandemic. And I suppose one of the questions that the pandemic has raised for me is the issue of food poverty, and also our relationship with other species. So at the moment, as you know, we have riots in New York and other cities across the US because of the injustices perpetrated on African Americans by the police in this country. But of course, these are just symbolic of a bigger structural issue in the US, where forms of incarceration, discrimination and inequality obviously extended between humans, but also to other species too. Now, in a post-COVID landscape, what we're going to need to start doing is thinking very carefully about how we feed everybody and the inefficiencies of meat production, not to mention the cruelty that follows very similar patterns of other species abuse to that which we've seen through historic slavery, and even current slavery under in systems, criminal justice systems that are geared towards incarcerating people en masse. We have to start asking questions about animal treatment and also animals as food supply if we really want to achieve justice, both in terms of access to food but also access to liberty. Sorry, the cat was in fact sitting on my copy of my book, so I'll crack on at this stage. This book is important to me, I guess because for all the reasons I've just said, but I also think that veganism is something that matters deeply to my students. It's something they've brought to the table recently, making quite literally to the table, but to make the point that actually these issues matter to younger generations. And it's not been a conversation we've had in architecture. We've not really thought about, if you like, designing beyond placing humans at the centre of our designs. We've had very anthropocentric architecture for a very long time, and not least thought about the architecture needed for other species to be either restored or sustained. So more broadly, my questions in my research and work concern what could an architecture of the post-Anthropocene look like. So it's Carol o'clock. Now, my excerpt initially is from chapter 1 and definitely begins with a little bit of a real bedtime story. So, the sexual politics of meat. A myth from the Bushmen. In the early times, men and women lived apart, the former hunting animals exclusively, the latter pursuing a gathering existence. 5 of the men who were out hunting, being careless creatures, let their fire go out. The women, who were careful and orderly, always kept their fire going. The men, having killed a springbok, became desperate for a means to cook it, so one of their number set out to get fire, crossed the river and met one of the women gathering seeds. When he asked her for some fire, she invited him to the feminine camp. While he was there, she said, "You are very hungry. Just wait until I pound up these seeds and I'll boil them and give you some." She made him some porridge. After he'd eaten it, she said, "Well, it's very nice food," and he said, "I will just stay with you." The men who were left behind in the male camp waited and wondered. They still had the springbok, and yet they still had no fire. The second man set out only to be tempted by female cooking and to take up residence in the camp of women. The same thing happened to the third. The 2 men left were very frightened. They suspected something terrible had happened to their comrades, and they cast divining bones, but the omens were favourable. The 4th man set out timidly, only to end by joining his comrades. The last man became very frightened indeed, and besides, by now, the springbok had in fact rotted. He took his bows and arrows and ran away. A minor adjustment with printer interactions. So, I left the British Library and my research on some women of the 1890s whose feminist working class newspaper advocated meatless diets, and went through the cafeteria line in a restaurant nearby. Vegetarian food in hand, I descended to the basement. A painting of Henry VIII eating steak and kidney pie greeted my gaze. On either side of the consuming, Henry were portraits of his 6 wives and other women. However, they were not eating steak and kidney pie, nor anything else made of meat. Catherine of Aragon held an apple in her hands. The Countess of Mark had a turnip, Anne Boleyn red grapes, and of Cleves a pear, and Jane Seymour blue grapes. Catherine Howard a carrot, and Catherine Parr a cabbage. People with power had always eaten meat. The aristocracy of Europe consumed large courses filled with every kind of meat, while the labourer consumed the complex carbohydrates. Dietary habits proclaim class distinctions, but they proclaim patriarchal distinctions as well. Women, second-class citizens, are more likely to eat what are considered to be second-class foods in patriarchal culture: vegetables, fruits and grains rather than meat. The sexism in meat eating recapitulates the class distinctions with an added twist. A mythology permeates all classes that meat is a masculine food and meat eating is a male activity. The male identification and meat eating. Meat-eating societies gain male identification by their choice of food, and meat textbooks heartily endorse this association. The meat we eat proclaims meat to be a virile and protective food, and thus a liberal meat supply has always been associated with a happy and virile people. Meat technology informs us that the virile Australian race is a typical example of heavy meat eaters. Leading gourmands refer to the virile of having the characteristics of an adult male, from vir, meaning man. Meat eating measures individual and societal virility. Meat is a constant for men, intermittent for women, a pattern painfully observed in famine situations today. Women are starving at a rate disproportionate to men. Lisa Leghorn and Mary Yudovsky surveyed this phenomenon in their book, Who Really Starves? Women and World Hunger. Women, they conclude, engage in deliberate self-deprivation, offering men the best foods at the expense of their own nutritional needs. For instance, they tell us that Ethiopian women and girls of all classes are obliged to prepare 2 meals, one for the males and a second, often containing no meat or other substantial protein, for the females. In fact, men's protein needs are less than those of pregnant and nursing women, and the disproportionate distribution of the main protein source occurs when women's need for protein is the greatest. Curiously, we are now being told that one should eat meat or fish or vegetables and chocolate and salt at least 6 weeks before becoming pregnant if one wants a boy. But if a girl is desired, no meat please, rather milk, cheese, nuts, beans and cereals. Fairy tales initiate us at an early age into the dynamics of eating and sex roles. The king in his counting house ate 24 blackbirds in a pie, originally 24 naughty boys, while the queen ate bread and honey. Cannibalism in fairy tales is generally a male activity, as Jack, after climbing his beanstalk, quickly learned. Folk tales of all nations depict giants as males and fond of eating human flesh. Witches, warped or monstrous women in the eyes of a patriarchal world, become the token female cannibals. A biblical example of the male prerogative for meat rankled Elizabeth Cady Stanton, a leading 19th century feminist, as can be seen by her terse comment on Leviticus 6 in the Woman's Bible. The meat so delicately cooked by the priests with wood and coals in the altar, in clean linen, that no woman was permitted to taste, only the males among the children of Aaron. Most food taboos address meat consumption, and they place more restrictions on women than men. The common foods forbidden to women are chicken, duck and pork. Forbidding meat to women in non-technological cultures increases its prestige. Even if the women raise the pigs, as they do in the Solomon Islands, they are rarely allowed to eat the pork. When they do receive some, it's at the dispensation of their husbands. In Indonesia, flesh food is viewed as the property of man. At feasts, the principal times when meat is available, it is distributed to the households according to the men in them. The system of distribution thus reinforces the prestige of the men in society. Worldwide, this patriarchal custom is found. In Asia, some cultures forbid women from consuming fish, seafood, chicken and duck, and eggs. In Equatorial Africa, the prohibition of chicken to women is common. The Kafir of India, for example, punished women who ate chicken by making them slaves, while the Walamo put to death anyone who violated the restrictions of eating fowl. Correspondingly, vegetables and other non-meat foods are viewed as women foods. This makes them undesirable to men. Ripping of paper. It's been stapled wrongly. Okay. In other groups, men require sauces to disguise the fact that they are eating women's foods. Men expect to have meat sauces to go with their porridge and will sometimes refuse to eat meat sauces made of greens or other vegetables, which is said to be women's food. In technological societies, cookbooks reflect the presumption that men eat meat. A random survey of cookbooks reveals that the barbecue sections of most cookbooks are addressed to men and feature meat. The food recommended for a Mother's Day tea does not include meat, but readers are advised that on Father's Day a dinner should include London broil because a state dinner has unfailing popularity with fathers. In a chapter on feminine hospitality, we are directed to serve vegetables, salad and soups. The new McCall's cookbook suggests that a man's favourite dinner is London broil. 20th century cookbooks only serve to confirm the historic pattern found in the 19th century when British working class families could not afford sufficient meat to feed the entire family. For the man only appears continually in many of the menus of these families when referring to meat. In adhering to the mythologies of a culture, men need meat, meat gives bull-like strength, the male breadwinner actually receives the meat. Social historians report that the lion's share of meat went to the husband. What then for women during the 19th century? On Sundays they might have a modest but good dinner. On other days their food was bread with butter or drippings, wheat tea, pudding and vegetables. The wife in very poor families is probably the worst fed of the household, observed Dr. Edward Smith in the first National Food Survey's British Dietary Habits in 1893. Where poverty forced a conscious distribution of meat, men received it. Many women emphasised they had saved the meat for their husbands. They were articulating the prevailing connections between meat eating and the male role. In situations of abundance, sex role assumptions about meat are not often blatantly expressed. For this reason, the diets of upper English class men and women are much more similar than the diets of upper class women and working class women. Moreover, the abundance of meat available in the United States, as opposed to the restricted amount available in England, there has been enough for all, except when meat supplies were controlled. For instance, enslaved black men receive half a pound of meat per day, while enslaved black women often found that they received little more than a quarter a day. Additionally, during the wars of the 20th century, the pattern of meat consumption recalled that of the English 19th century working class families. With one variation, the worker of the country's household, the soldier, got the meat. Civilians were urged to learn how to cook without meat. The hearty meat eating that characterises the diet of a man is not only a symbol of male power, it is an index of racism. I do not mean racism in the sense that we're treating one class of animals, those who are not human beings, differently than we treat another, those who are. As Isaac Bashevis Singer uses the term in Enemies, a Love Story, as often as Hernan had witnessed the slaughter of animals and fish, he always had the same thought. In their behaviour towards creatures, all men were Nazis. The smugness with which man could do with other species as he pleased exemplified the most extreme racist theories, the principle that might is right. I mean racism as the requirement that power arrangements and customs that favour white people prevail, and that the acculturation of people of colour to this standard includes the imposition of white habits of white Western world's enactment of racism when the issue is meat eating. The first is that if the meat supply is limited, white people should get it, but if meat is plentiful, all people should get it. This is a variation of the standard theme of the sexual politics of meat. The hierarchy of meat protein reinforces a hierarchy of race, class and sex. 19th century advocates of white superiority endorsed meat as a superior food. Brain workers required lean meat as their main meal, but the savage and lower classes could live exclusively on coarser foods, according to George Beard, a 19th century medical doctor who specialised in the disease of middle-class people. He recommended that when white, civilised middle-class men became susceptible to nervous exhaustion, they should eat more meat. To him and for many others, cereals and fruits were lower than meat on the scale of evolution, and thus appropriate foods for other races and white women, who appeared to be lower on the scale of evolution as well. Racism and sexism together upheld meat as a white man's food. Into the 20th century, the notion was that meat eating contributed to the Western world's preeminence. Publicists for a meat industry in the 1940s wrote, "We know meat-eating races have been and are leaders in the progress made by mankind in its upward struggle through the ages." They are referring to the upward struggle of the white race. One revealing aspect of this upward struggle is the charge of cannibalism that appeared during the years of colonisation. The word cannibalism entered our vocabulary after the discovery of the New World, derived from the Spaniards' mispronunciation of the name of the people of the Caribbean. It linked these people of colour with the act. As Europeans explored the continents of North and South America and Africa, the indigenous peoples of those lands became accused of cannibalism, the ultimate savage act. Once labelled, their defeat and enslavement at the hands of civilised Christian whites became justifiable. Of the judges of cannibalism against the indigenous peoples, Arndt's philosopher found very little independent verification. One source of dubious testimony on cannibalism was then plagiarised by others. So, my doorbell kept ringing, but we're ignoring that. One cause of cannibalism was thought to be a lack of animal protein, yet most Europeans themselves, during centuries of European expansion, were not subsisting on animal protein every day. The majority of cultures in the world satisfied their protein needs through vegetables and grains. By charging indigenous peoples with cannibalism and thus demonstrating their utterly savage ways, for they supposedly did to humans what Europeans did to animals, one justification for colonisation was provided. Racism is perpetuated each time meat is thought to be the best protein source. The emphasis on the nutritional strengths of animal protein distorts the dietary history of most cultures in which complete protein dishes were made of vegetables and grains. Information about these dishes is overwhelmed by an ongoing cultural and political commitment to meat eating. So I think I might jump now to the conclusion section of this chapter. I think we are short on time. Meat is a symbol of patriarchy. In her essay, Deciphering a Meal, the noted anthropologist Mary Douglas suggests that the order in which we serve foods and the food we insist on being present at a meal reflect a taxonomy of classification that mirrors and reinforces our larger culture. A meal is an amalgam of food dishes, each constituent part of a whole, each with an assigned value. In addition, each dish is introduced in precise order. A meal does not begin with a dessert nor end with soup. All is seen as leading up to and then coming down from the entree that is meat. The pattern is evidence of stability, as Douglas explains, the ordered system in which the strong arousal of power of a threat to weaken or confuse that category. To remove meat is to threaten the structure of the larger patriarchal culture. Someone keeps trying to ring me, it's impossible to do anything about it. Maribel Morgan, one excerpt on how women should accede to every male desire, reported in her Total Woman cookbook that one must be careful about introducing foods that are seen as a threat. I discovered that Charlie seemed to be threatened by certain foods, quote unquote. He was suspicious of my casseroles, thinking I had sneaked in some wheat germ or good-for-you vegetables that he wouldn't like. Mary McCarthy's Birds of America provides a fictional illustration of the intimidating aspect to a man of a woman's refusal to eat meat. Miss Scott, a vegetarian, is invited to a NATO general's house for Thanksgiving. Her refusal of turkey angers the general. Not able to take this rejection seriously, as male dominance requires a continual recollection of itself on everyone's plate, the general loads her plates up with turkey and then ladles gravy over the potatoes as well as the meat, thus contaminating her vegetable foods. McCarthy's description of his actions with the food mirrors the warlike custom associated with military battles. He had seized the gravy boat like a weapon in hand to combat. No wonder they had made him a brigadier general. At least that mystery was solved. The general continues to behave in a bellicose fashion and after dinner proposes a toast in honour of an 18-year-old who was enlisted to fight in Vietnam. During the ensuing argument about war, the general defends the bombing of Vietnam with the rhetorical question, what's so sacred about a civilian? This upsets the hero, necessitating that the general's wife apologise for her husband's behaviour. Between you and me, she confides in him, it kind of got under his skin to see that girl refusing to touch her food. I saw that right away. Male belligerence in this area is not limited to fictional military men. Men who batter women have often used the absence of meat as a pretext for violence against women. Women's failure to serve meat is not the cause of the violence against them. Controlling men use it, like anything else, as an excuse for their violence, and yet because real men eat meat. Batterers have a cultural icon to draw upon as they deflect attention from the need to control. As one woman battered by her husband reported, it would start with him being angry over trivial things, a trivial little thing like cheese instead of meat on a sandwich. Another woman stated, "A month ago he threw scalding water over me, leaving a scar on my right arm, because I gave him a pie with potatoes and vegetables instead of fresh meat." Men who became vegetarians challenge an essential part of the masculine role. They are opting for women's food. How dare they? Refusing meat means a man is effeminate, a sissy, a fruit. Indeed, in 1836, the response to the vegetarian regimen of that day, known as Grahamism, charged that emasculation is the first fruit of Grahamism. Men who choose not to eat meat repudiate one of their masculine privileges. The New York Times explored this idea in an editorial on the masculine nature of eating meat. Instead of the John Wayne type epitome of the masculine meat eater, the new male hero is vulnerable, like Alan Alda, Mikhail Baryshnikov and Phil Donahue. They might eat dead fishes and dead chickens, but not red meat. Alda and Donahue, among other men, have not only repudiated the macho role, but also macho food. According to the Times, believe me, the end of macho marks the end of meat eating, the end of meat and potatoes man, and frankly, we won't miss either. I will leave it there because I believe my time is up. But I guess reading back on this book, which is now obviously at least a couple of decades old, and thinking about the context in which it was written and understanding that particular wave of feminism, we would identify this as second or even borderline third wave feminism. It's really understanding that these, if you like, traditions within the way that we construct relationships and consequently our environments, sorry, I have asthma, makes it very hard to think of actually trying to do something that is truly inclusive space if other species and their well-being isn't considered as central to that transformation. And before I choke to death, I will in fact leave it there. Thank you very much for having me.